Hey everyone, welcome to our third HBAR Foundry Town Hall live stream. I've got an excellent guest with me today, and I am representing the Foundry, but I thought it might be important for us to kind of go over what the Foundry is. I know a lot of people have asked about this, so why don't I just real quickly share what we have on our GitHub repo at the HBAR Foundry. You can find this at hbar-foundry as the organization at github.com. But I figured let's talk real quick about the mission and kind of the role of the HBAR Foundry, just so that everybody knows the context of why we exist and why we're doing what we're doing. So the Foundry's mission is to unite Hedera ecosystem stakeholders, promote Hedera-related tech adoption, and foster collaboration, establishing Hedera as a global leader on distributed ledger technology. If we look at what the roles are, really what we focus on is promoting and defining standards, evaluating and promoting projects, collaborating through communication, and building tools, whether they're libraries or utilities. So this is what the Foundry is. It's basically a group, a community of builders, whether they're business builders or technical builders, that came together a few years ago. Jeremy was the one who pulled it together from Ledgerama. And it started off as just a community for discussing things in the Hedera ecosystem and has now kind of evolved into more of an established community. We work on open source projects. We work on helping each other navigate the Hedera ecosystem. We work on connecting projects together. And so that's what we do. Today, I'm actually very pleased to have a special guest. This is Hedera's Chief Open Source Officer, Andrew Aitken. And he's going to join me today. We're going to ask him a number of questions. I also want to make sure that everybody in the community is open to ask any questions you want. If you're watching on YouTube, feel free to drop your comments or questions in YouTube. And we've got a few of the HBAR Foundry members sitting to the side who are going to triage those questions and then raise them to us as we go through these questions with Andrew. All right, so without any further ado, let me go ahead and bring Andrew on. Hey, Andrew, thank you for joining us.
Hey, Ken. Thank you for inviting me. Really happy to be here.
Awesome. Well, you're the new Chief Open Source Officer. You and I have been playing in the Hedera ecosystem for a number of years. We even worked last year on the Open Source Task Force together a summer ago, I think it was. So the two of us have worked together, but maybe not everybody knows who you are, how you got here. Why don't you tell us a little bit about your journey in this Hedera ecosystem?
Okay. How far back do you want me to go there, Ken?
Let's where you became aware of Hedera. Let's start with that one, and then when we get to the end, we'll stop.
So I was head of open source at Wipro, which is one of the large global systems integrators, and internally, our council member at the time, and Wipro's a council member of Hedera. At the time, our council member reached out to me and said, Hedera is trying to develop their open source strategy. Do you think you might be able to help them out? And that's something I've been doing for over 2 decades now, is developing open source strategy for a variety of different types of organizations. So I said, sure. And so that's how I was brought in through our council relationship to participate on the open source task force with you, Ken, and others, and had an opportunity to spend a few hours a week here and there, as you know, working on that strategy. But as it got closer towards earlier this year, as the strategy began to get ready to be implemented, they wanted me to help with defining the role of Chief Open Source Officer, help refer a number of candidates, which I did so. And at that time was not considering joining Hedera. It was at the Santa Clara Council member meeting in June of this year, I think July, that I was invited to participate. I remember sitting in this room in the Google auditorium. They were kind enough to host the council meeting. Sitting in this room with 60, 70 other people, just frankly, it was, wow, these are some really, really smart people, and there's a lot of cool stuff going on. And so I thought about it, and I was clear. I said, I want to be a part of this. So that day, I actually reached out to Brett, the chair and president, and a couple of the board members that I had been working with, and said, I want to put my hat in the ring. And I did. And obviously, here I am. And it's always nice. I didn't realize it at the time, but it's always nice to actually have written your own job description.
Right.
So that's pretty cool.
Yeah, it was interesting because you and I both were part of the vetting process for the candidate pool. So as we were going through and looking for people, I know you and I have been actively involved, and it did make sense. You having understood the intricacies of the open source strategy of Hedera, for you to play a major role in that development, and then I also was brought in to help with vetting a number of the candidates, and we had some incredible candidates. As a matter of fact, I kind of thought we had settled on one. I want to say it was April or May of last year. And I don't know what happened, right? Logistics, life changes, whatever happened. But I remember it kind of going silent after we did those interviews and me going, okay, what's happening? And it was a month or two later. So it makes sense that June, because I think it was in April or early May when we had finished, maybe it was in April that we finished our interviews. And I was kind of thinking in May, like, what's happening with the open source officer role? Like, when's that happening? And then as part of the Foundry, I was looking forward to it because I wanted to have a point of contact that would participate in some Foundry activities at Hedera in the open source space. I was really like anxious to get that person in. And when you got announced, I was like, oh, okay, this is great. I know Andrew, so this works out really well. So it was a really cool surprise to have this summer when you got announced. And I thought, okay, I'm going to reach out to Andrew and we'll start talking about this Foundry and how we can make it useful to the community. So not everybody is aware of what a chief open source officer does. Would you mind kind of elaborating what that role is?
Sure. I'd like to start by saying, yeah, it sounds like a really grandiose title. Just don't worry, I don't take myself too seriously. But I do take the role seriously. So, and let me set the context a little bit by giving a brief history here. Some of the members, some of the participants on the call may be aware of the history, some may not be. So it was almost 2 years ago that Hedera Hashgraph LLC and the council acquired the IP rights to Hashgraph itself, right? Subsequent to that, they made the determination about a little over a year and a half ago, that they were going to open source all of the IP, which they then went and did under the Apache license. That's when we got involved and started working on the strategy. And they needed someone who had the background and expertise to help them implement the council strategy. And so that's really what my role is to, and I have a lot of background in this whole open source foundation community. For those of you who may be familiar with the Linux Foundation, I was actually brought in around 20 years ago to help Jim Zemlin craft the initial strategy for the Linux Foundation. And since then, I've advised on a number of other foundations. I've been on the boards and advisory, board representative advisory board. So I've seen of a number of foundations. So I've seen a lot of what works and what doesn't work. And I think that was part of the reason that they decided to bring me on board. And so that's really my role, is to take make recommendations to the council after getting input from the community. I want to be really clear about that. I'm not doing this in a vacuum, right? I am reaching out to different elements, different parts of the ecosystem. I'm reaching out to my own expert community. I am working closely with Swirlds, obviously a key part of our the community, and taking their input, kind of stewing that with my own expertise and making some recommendations to the council. They then will give me the feedback. Believe me, they're very comfortable giving me direct feedback. Let's just say that. So I'll take their feedback and then implement the agreed upon strategy. So that's really what my role is.
So who are the parties that you bring in that decision-making process? Like, how does that work? Or I should say, in that feedback loop, when you're trying to gather information. You mentioned Swirlds as being one of those.
Absolutely.
One of those parties. Who else are you involving in that? discussion?
Well, the rest of the direct Hedera ecosystem, such as Hashgraph Association, HBAR Foundry, DLT Science Foundation, and as you know, and Jim and others know, I've reached out directly to them to kind of get their perspective on it. I do have my own, obviously being in this space for 20 years, I do have a few other relationships. People who have been involved in Linux.org, founding of CNCF, community leadership at Red Hat, and other kind of key open source stakeholders who have also been intimately involved in driving successful communities, setting up foundations, that kind of thing. So I'm taking all of this input. And I really, as you know, I stress to you personally, it is important that I receive input, as much input as possible, but at some point I have to cut that off, right? Yeah. Put it together and make my recommendations. And I'm at that stage. Yep.
Awesome. Yeah. And you mentioned CNCF in there. Most people are familiar with CNCF's work around Kubernetes. Mm-hmm. I remember that was when we were talking through the open source strategy, we were also talking about how do we structure our GitHub projects. And there were two major maybe patterns that you and I were exploring. One of them was the Russ Lang pattern, which is a very informal, meritocratic approach, but can potentially take forever to make decisions. And certain decisions like async still aren't made. Yeah. So years later, people have solved it in libraries. And but the alternative, which was maybe a more formal structure, was that Linux Foundation, CNCF, Kubernetes style. Which, by the way, in the Foundry, that's kind of how we're structuring it as well. We're kind of leaning more towards that CNCF approach.
I noticed a few similarities.
Yeah, exactly. And so it's great that you have that experience, because I think, I love the Russ Lang community. It's perfect for what it needs to do. We're talking about language specifications and things that cannot break. And so sometimes it takes longer discussions to solve those problems. But when you need to get stuff done, sometimes you need to just have more formalized structure, maybe more granular charters when we talk about each, subcommittee or sub-team having their own charters. And so I was really happy because you were kind of the advocate for CNCF model, and I was kind of the advocate for the Russ Lang model. And so when we started building the Foundry, I was kind of following that CNCF model. And then when I found that you were going to be the chief open source officer, I was like, well, perfect. We're already aligned on that strategy. So, but speaking of that strategy, what would you say the objectives of Hedera's open source strategy is? What are the high level objectives?
It's pretty straightforward, right? Is building a community and foundation that is inclusive, right? Is based on open source best practices, both from a governance perspective, a development perspective, and provides the right value proposition for people to participate. And a lot of that boils down to ensuring that there's an economic value proposition for people to participate and contribute. And this is there are a couple challenges with launching successful foundations. And that is one, you can't treat the audience as one size fits all. Right. You have to define who the stakeholders are. You have to create different personas representing those stakeholders, and you have to ensure that you have the right message and value proposition for each of them. The days of build it and they will come actually never existed for open source. Right. You have to provide a lot of support, ongoing care and feeding to the community, making sure that they're engaged. And being a good steward. And it's really, open source fundamentally is about two things to be successful. One, it's about a license. And I am an absolute believer in OSI approved licenses, right? All open source should be under an OSI approved license. And the second is behaviors, right? If you don't have the right behaviors as a steward of a community, then you're just not going to be successful, no matter how cool that technology is. Right.
What's an example of the right behaviors?
The right behaviors is recognizing that you need to be a good steward for a longer period of time than you probably think. Recognizing that it needs to be inclusive, that you need to provide opportunities for people who want to be and are qualified to be leaders in that community. And doing what you're saying you're going to do, that's so critical here. That is perhaps one of the biggest failures that I've seen. It's also not about not recognizing that you may make a mistake, right? You may make as you put together the product roadmap, or you make certain commitments on how you're going to, or when you're going to achieve certain milestones. Things happen, right? Mm-hmm. There are a whole bunch of different reasons why things may change. Don't try and simply talk your way out of that. Be honest and open with the community, right, as to why something may have changed. That's the right behavior.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. There's a few things that you said that kind of stick out to me. I know Jim and I in the HBAR Foundry have had this, Jim Nasser and I have had this discussion before about, when's the time to discuss and when's the time to act. And sometimes it's more important to get something done than it is to get the discussion perfect. And sometimes, people are depending on some of this leadership to happen. Mm-hmm. And so we just either have to make decisions, or we focus and prioritize on what's the most important thing to get done. And sometimes you make plans and those plans don't pan out in the order that you mm-hmm. had expected or you had discussed previously. And it's more important that we just maintain that space of discussion, that communication, where we continually update each other on that progress and correct as necessary. But you had said something a little bit earlier too. You mentioned incentivizing the players in the ecosystem. You'd mentioned economic incentives. What did that mean?
Well, I'm not sure I said incentivizing. That's a loaded term, so I probably want to stay away from that. But providing economic opportunity.
Okay.
So that's really key to success here. Is starting from the beginning, understand that people are going to participate for their self-interests, whatever that self-interest may be. And there's nothing wrong with that. And the more you can support those self-interests, as long as they align to the charter of the community, right? You can't support things that don't align with the values and the charter of the community, right? Mm-hmm. As long as a person's or an organization's self-interests align with that, then you need to figure out how to support it. Right. And that's providing the resources, the tools, the easy onboarding experience, even direct support with them. Look, one of the things that I'm going to be working on with our council members and other people who are building apps that run on top of the platform is helping them understand what that economic opportunity is, and how they can take advantage of it and why. Right. There are lots of applications that run on top of the network, but not all of the organizations behind those applications actually are engaged or contributing to the community. Part of it is because in some instances I found so far, they simply may not understand why they should, right? They're consuming this software, they're building cool stuff that runs on top of the network, and then helping them understand why it's important to begin to engage and contribute. It's not just out of goodwill, right? That message doesn't resonate with many people, or they simply don't have the time or ability to contribute out of goodwill, right? So it's fundamentally helping them understand why it's in their best interest to support the organization. Hope that makes sense.
Well, I mean, can we be a little bit more concrete about that? Like, what would be an example? I don't want you to use a real life example because there mm-hmm. might be goods and bads that you probably don't want to bring up, but
that's okay.
But what would be a hypothetical example of identifying that economic opportunity and enabling it? Are we talking about like an organization that builds an open source library for their internal use, and your goal is to say, hey guys, let's open source that?
You're right.
Trying to help them understand why that's valuable?
That's exactly it. And in some instances, they may want it may be about driving co-innovation. Through the community. It may be if they feel if their technology is so cool, maybe there's an opportunity to become a de facto standard. And mm-hmm. today that can almost only be achieved by open source. Okay. So these are just an example. And there's still a perspective out there that I've run into that being open source means you're giving away your rights, all right? Or you're actually losing the right for commercial opportunity. That's simply not the case.
Right.
Today, it really isn't. There are a whole host of successful commercial open source vendors that are doing quite well for themselves, effectively utilizing this notion of open source and frictionless distribution.
Yeah, I mean, Netflix kind of comes to mind as probably one of the leaders in chaos testing open source tooling,
right?
Where they've put out their Simian Army, which I think is now all changed, the titling and stuff. But yeah, I mean, they're definitely a successful for-profit organization that is very heavily involved in some key infrastructure in the open source space.
Yeah.
And
absolutely. And they did that for co-innovation. Right, that's one of the key reasons that they open source those tools. But there are plenty of other organizations that have done it for direct revenue reasons, either through licensing or support or subscription or whatnot. Right.
Yeah, I know there are some that do kind of a dual license. Well, they'll say, for nonprofit or for personal use, this library is available. If you want to use commercial, it falls under a different license. Or in some cases, they'll say, they'll have revenue targets. Well, they'll say, if you hit this certain revenue milestone, now you need to talk to us about commercial licensing. But outside of that, you can use this however you want. And so we do see a lot of that in the open source space. I think it's also important to understand that sometimes when you're building libraries, the benefit of the library is not your solution. That's not your product, right? It may be a part of your product. But it could A, benefit other people, and B, if it's popular enough, other people are going to start contributing to it.
Yep.
I can give an example of this in one of Launchbadge's projects, SQLX, which is now starting to become the de facto SQL connector for the Rust language. For the longest time, Launchbadge was building it because Launchbadge needed it. We built it, we open sourced it because we needed it for a lot of our projects. As a matter of fact, most projects we build are using SQLX. We're getting to the point now where people are starting to contribute back to it, but it's been 3 years of us almost being the sole steward and maintainer and contributor to it. But now we're starting to get some serious traction as it really takes off and matures. And I think this maybe touches back to your previous comment about, the stewardship maybe lasting longer than you would think. We thought, let's build this cool product and next month we'll have the entire Rust community contributing to it. It took about 3 years to start getting contributions.
And there are ways, depending upon resources and so on, to short circuit that probably a little bit. But it takes a while. It's typically much harder. And I can't tell you how many enterprises that I've been involved in multiple sectors, from oil and gas, financial services, manufacturing, such. They want to open source something or contribute a significant asset to an existing foundation, create their own, and so on. And because of their brand, people fall in love with their own branding. Conceptually, there's nothing wrong with that. But you have to understand a brand only goes so far. So way back when, I was involved in the first open source project at Facebook, was brought in to kind of do some due diligence on that strategy. And of course, they're Facebook. So they assume we're going to open source it and everyone will come, right? And what people mistake for, and this is really, really important distinction, what people mistake for substance is that initial launch period. Whether you're any big brand, it doesn't matter, Facebook or any big brand, you're probably going to get a lot of downloads, a lot of pull requests, a lot of comments, those first 30 to 90 days. People fall in love with that response. The contributing organization, they feel, we're done. Look at all this. Look at all this activity. So many organizations have fallen into that trap. It's not that first 30 to 90 days. The slog becomes 180 days to 700 days, right? That's when, because there's so much demand today for developer mindshare. I'm sure everybody on this call has probably looked at 4 or 5 different cool technologies that are demanding their attention or want their time and want their contributions. And so you really have to recognize that if you don't provide long-term stewardship, that your behaviors don't match what your words, and you don't provide that opportunity, then that interest goes away really quickly.
That's interesting. Yeah, so I've heard a few things now is, recognizing and aligning the economic opportunity, going into this with a vision of long-term stewardship, making sure that you encourage the correct behaviors. And you also mentioned earlier having the correct licensing, because that's important. If you don't have the right licensing, then maybe the behaviors don't matter as much because people can't access it because of legal reasons.
Yeah.
And so I've heard a few of those things from you. And maybe I don't want to get too much into the details of how that's, I'm sure you're preparing this for release at Hedera so that everybody can kind of see it. But in an ideal scenario, how would you see the Hedera open source strategy rolling out? Like, what avenues is that going through? What communities is that going through? Like, what type of engagement would you like to see?
So again, we're going to recognize that there are multiple different stakeholders for our community, right? And we're going to work on ensuring that we have the right value proposition message and support for them. But it's also not just about looking at what we do in our own vacuum, the Hedera community or the foundation. It's also recognize that you're a part of a much, much bigger whole, and you need to be active and contribute yourself. So we are going to be participating in other foundations, and we already are now. And so you have to recognize that whatever this foundation construct becomes, that it's a part of a much wider whole. And you can't just look at your own community and foundation myopically. You have to look at others out there and engage consistently with them. Again, it's not about just getting somebody to join one of the working groups for 90 days. It's ensuring that you have a long-term strategy for engaging in the broader ecosystem also. That's really important.
Yeah, no, I feel that in the HBAR Foundry, we've got an incredible group of people. It's a small group of people. I think we've got 65 people in the Foundry right now. We've got a handful of working groups. But I feel that, like, if you're not constantly engaging and providing the correct value proposition, things go stale real quick.
Absolutely.
And so it's an effort. It's almost a full-time job, which is why we're so excited to have you join us as with a full-time job. Hey, we did get a question though about the licensing, because we talked about, one of your comments was you have to have the right licensing. Here's the comment: how do you determine the right licensing to use when open sourcing? This is an interesting question in itself.
Yeah, well, there's a couple different aspects to this. One is obviously in our case, everything's open sourced under the Apache 2 license, which is a permissive license, which gives you a lot of flexibility and freedom, which is a good thing. But you have to ensure that aligns with your business model. And here's one of the challenges or mistakes that people make, is that they think open source is a business model. Open source is not a business model. It's a licensing and development and execution strategy, right? You have to have a product that has a business model to start with, right? That is, are you licensing, you support, are you hosted, whatever. You have to understand how you're going to make money. Then you apply the kind of the best pieces of open source to that to understand how it can accelerate your own business model. Right. And so that's key. So first step is understanding what market you play in, some very traditional things. What market you play in, what's the value proposition, who your buyer is, how you're going to make revenue, and then how does open source fit in there? How does it accelerate what you're going to do? And is it dependent upon other technologies? In the case, if it's dependent upon Hedera, again, Hedera is under no flexible open source license, so you don't have too many restrictions. But if it's dependent upon, say, a different operating system under a copyleft license, such as GPL, it may be a bit more restrictive. If you're tying into a hosted offering and that's under the AGPL, then you have to really look at the technical implications of those licenses and your product, right? And that's really important. So it starts with fundamentally understanding kind of who you are and how you're going to thrive, and then how does open source accelerate all of that?
I think this is
a question.
Yeah, and it's an important thing to consider too when you're building products, because especially if you're going into, say, you're going into an acquisition phase with your product or company, like one of the core things they're going to do if you're a software technology company is they're going to review your underlying open source licensing inclusion. So if you're, say you've got conflicts in the licensing, you've got copyleft licensing right alongside MIT or Apache licensing, there can be legal conflicts with having those two licenses sitting under the hood of your product that you're trying to sell to a buyer, right? And so I see this come up all the time. This is why, what is it, Black Duck is the organization that does a lot of this services where they review licensing. But that's a due diligence step, is making sure that you've got the right licenses under the hood. But also and I would actually argue that in a product, it's not just your product that is going to get open source. There's probably libraries in your product that you built that you're going to open source. And I think what you're saying is understand the business first. Understand what your business requirements are and the values and goals are. And then how does open source under the hood that you're building, this product you're building is not just one product. It's a connection of a bunch of different products and libraries. How do those licenses affect the business strategy? And if you're going to open source things, what benefits do you get from that? What is the value that it brings in? So maybe a good example of that is like our wallet ecosystem right now, where Brandon Davenport kind of took the lead as a project manager, pushing that effort recently, bringing together a bunch of wallets in the ecosystem and a bunch of builders in the ecosystem. And the goal of that was like, listen, if you're a wallet and you want your wallet to work with the most dApps out there, we probably should come up with a standardized mechanism for those dApps to install one library that now supports all your wallets. And so the opportunity there for the wallets is I get access to the most dApps. The opportunity for the dApp developer is I only have to install one connector. I don't have to install a connector for every wallet. I just choose one connector, and anybody can choose whatever wallet they want to use. And that's where open source is kind of like that's a microcosm of exactly what you're talking about, of aligning the business opportunity with understanding the value proposition of open source and how it fits into the business model.
Exactly. And there's now a new foundation, relatively new, called the Open Wallet Foundation, which is also looking to address those issues, which we're engaged in. But back to something you said earlier, and for those folks out there that are actually building applications, it's going to become more and more prevalent when organizations that you want to sell that software to are going to be asking for something called software bill of materials, and SBOM. And to your point, that's just it's just a list of all the elements of your product, all the different components and libraries and so on that are in your software, and that you attest to what's in that software. So one thing you mentioned, Black Duck, there are a number of others out there, White Source and so on, that will actually do an analysis of your code and everything that's in your product and produce this bill of materials. It also produces lists of where the conflicts are, identifies the level of the conflict, and so on. And this is going to become more and more standard. The U.S. federal government is driving a lot of these activities. There are open source foundations. The most prevalent is the Open Source Software Security Foundation, that's providing tools to help organizations ensure that they're building secure software. So it's not just license conflicts, but it's also security issues. Right. So I would recommend that at the earliest reasonable time, this is a recommendation to all those people building apps out there today, that they look at their code, they scan their code, and they produce this bill of materials. And one thing that if they're not that new, if they're relatively new to open source, one thing to understand is to make sure that what's called a deep license analysis is done. Because today, the best software developers also think like assemblers. So they go out into open source and look at what is there, 60 million open source projects out there today. They look at open source and they identify, hey, I'm trying to, or I need to do this. I'm trying to do this. Does it exist already? In many instances, it does. So they're downloading software and then they're putting that unique glue, that unique glue together to create this application that is composed of different open source elements. But in those elements, what you have to realize is that other people who created those projects are also downloading things from open source or from PyPy or some other repo, right? And they don't know what's in the software that they've downloaded that you've now incorporated into your own application. And so there could be issues there. So that's why when you do this thing called creating a software bill of materials, examine your code, you have to do a deep license analysis to understand not just your code and the open source component, but what's in that open source component.
Right. Yeah.
So I'm a high horse. I'm really big on that.
But that's interesting though, because when we think about the Hedera ecosystem, does this become part of your role as coordinating that effort and maybe helping people do that deep license analysis? I don't want to say that we would do the deep license analysis, but making sure that there's an awareness, or maybe there's a working group that says, okay, if there's going to be a Hedera open source project, we need to make this deep analysis available to anybody who's going to consume our project.
Yeah, so we're and a foundation shouldn't assume the actual role of doing that work and providing any legal advice.
Right.
Okay. We simply, a foundation shouldn't be in that role. But it is a part of the role to actually help and provide resources to get that done. Right. So having relationships or being able to recommend organizations that can actually do that analysis and provide feedback to community members who want that. Mm-hmm. Sure, that's appropriate, but not actually doing that. It's simply it's not the foundation's role.
Where can we find the foundation's role, or are those things still in the works?
Those things are still in the works. We are going, believe me, as fast as we can.
Yeah, I understand.
But we also have to do this right. Yep. There's a lot of excitement. There's a lot of energy internally to do this, to get this out there and do this quickly. But again, we need to do it right. So even just last week, it was requested for me to provide some analysis on another foundation that had been launched, which I won't name at this point in time. Had been launched 3 months ago, I think. And as a part of my free time and my community activities, this is the type of thing I'm happy to do. So I went through what had been launched and pretty quickly identified who the entities were behind the organization, why they had not been public about that, and that they had launched way too early. Right. And so it's not just, it's a successful community and foundation isn't just about a governance and a charter. That's critical, right? That's important foundation for the foundation. But it's also about how you're going to, what are your activities over the next 12, 18, 36 months that are going to bring in more people, right? Ensuring that you have an effective organization that will drive that foundation, that will manage it on a day-to-day basis, that will continue to reach out to the community, that will bring in, that will create a member structure. You have to have a member structure of the foundations, right? Not just a governance model and charter, but a member structure. And you have to actually you want to launch with members, not just one entity, but launch with members to demonstrate momentum and the value of participating.
Yeah, and I think, you see this with Linux Foundation and their sub-projects. You see this even with Rust Foundation and the Rust core team, the team structure. There's like the Linux Foundation is a mechanism for like fiscal hosting. It's where all the money happens.
Fiscal and legal hosting,
yeah, fiscal and legal hosting. So it's like a legal entity that kind of acts as the umbrella for all of the projects under it. It's also the fiscal host, so it can take in money and it can distribute money to the projects.
Yep.
And there's a board up there that can make decisions about what sub-projects should and shouldn't exist. But when you get down to the sub-project, they're relatively self-governing. When you get down into the sub-project, you start looking at things like hyperledger. Like that group is usually managed by some type of technical steering committee, or in the Rust community, we call it the core team or the team structure, versus the foundation that sits above it. Does Hedera see itself, that foundation, as being kind of like the legal and fiscal host model, like Linux Foundation? Like what's really, as a matter of fact, I'll even bring up Tony's comment here of like, what are the differences between Hedera and the Linux Foundation? Like, it's pretty common to see that fiscal host and legal host structure above the team structure. And then the teams, the sub-teams, are relatively self-governing, other than the fact that when they get money and resources and legal protection, it's coming from the foundation above. Is that similar to how we're going to structure the Hedera, or is that still in the works, or is that something you don't want to discuss right now? But
that's still in the works. It's still in the works. Right. And there are some, we want to look, there's a lot of positive and negative examples out there of how to do a foundation. Right. And so we're going to take, hopefully, the best from any and all of those. And under the Linux Foundation, they have that same, they have that, as you just mentioned, many of them are self-governed. They have that very same, those same examples, some that have worked and are working really well and some that aren't. Right. But there's one thing that the Linux Foundation, to your point, they do more than just have a technical steering committee and working groups. They also provide a management layer. So if Hyperledger, they have an executive director in Daniela, and they have a CTO in Hart. So, and then they have marketing support and other support that's provided by the Linux Foundation. Every foundation also has a management layer that is provided by the Linux Foundation. And they've built up a pretty solid model on how to do that. But you also, one of the observations that I've seen about some of those projects on the Linux Foundation, where they haven't been successful, is because they're self-managed with support from the Linux Foundation, they can lose steam also. They can make their own mistakes around, technical mistakes, not aligned to their constituents, not aligned to what their constituents are trying to achieve, just loss of momentum, incorrect branding, all sorts of things like that, right? It's not Linux Foundation is not a panacea. They do a whole bunch of things right, and I admire and respect what they do. But because of this self-governing nature of many of the foundations, we're human, right? We make mistakes. So to the question's not up there anymore, but specifically to that question, we're in the process, and this is frankly, this is a part of the value I bring, because I've seen a lot of what works and what doesn't work. And I'm taking the input, and I'm relatively new to Web3, as you know, Ken. So I'm taking the input of people who have been in this ecosystem for a long time, trying to understand the differences and incorporate that into some of the best practices that I do know on how to launch and run a foundation.
And that's an interesting point, is that, kind of the ethos of Web3 is this decentralized nature, whether it's governance or technology. And I think a lot of what we see in open source is very much that decentralized governance. And sometimes it's formalized, and sometimes it's informalized, sometimes it's inefficient, sometimes it's efficient. So I think I see like a natural value here, a natural value prop that's shared between the Web3 and the open source communities. But I think your point is well taken. Like, your expertise is in the open source space. And what we're trying to do is build the best open source organization around Hedera's technology, which happens to be a Web3 technology.
Right.
And so I think we'll find a lot more commonality in the behaviors and the value propositions in that space. And now the question is, which model best fits that ethos. And I think that's TBD.
It is, but that's assumed TBD, right? I want to be as responsive as reasonably possible to the community, right? There is a lot of energy. I know the community wants to have a voice in how we do this, and they want to begin engaging and contributing. So I'm very, very respectful and mindful of that, but it has to be done right. That's the first thing, and it has to be done with the full support of the council. Because back to your point about the distributed nature of Hedera, the governance model and the ecosystem, our formal guidance comes from the council. And I have to say, Ken, when I was first getting familiar with this and when we were working on the open source strategy, and I was told that there are 29 council members that help make decisions, I'm like, oh my God, you're kidding me. That's never going to work. It's going to take us years to get anything
Decision
done.
by committee.
Yeah, I was really, really skeptical. And of course, there's a board elected by the council. But that was one of my big concerns getting involved here, because I've been a part of some foundations that had 15 to 20 governing members, and those were cluster whats. But I'm really so impressed about how it runs. Yes, we can't make a decision tomorrow. That's reality, right? But that's okay, because we have a lot of really, really smart and engaged council members. We have an incredible board that I'm truly impressed with. And so that's a part of really what helped me overcome my concerns about having a distributed governance model, was getting to know the people and understand their commitment to being successful here.
So let me throw a grenade into that one. All right, I'm going to throw a wrench into the gears of this. So how do we involve the community in that council decision-making process? Because the community it's going to be thousands of people, right?
Hopefully.
Yeah. And we're talking thousands of people who have interests, who are going to be voicing their opinions. How do you wrangle all of that, and how do you kind of bring the community's interest in alignment with the council's interest, understanding that everybody has slightly different interests, competing interests, completely unrelated interests?
Well, just keep in mind, it's two ways, right? The council has to be engaged in the community also. Today, they're engaged in the governance of the Hedera network, mainnet, right? And as the community and the foundation evolves, it's important for them to be a member, to participate there also. But that's the rationale behind really focusing on growing this community and moving to a foundation that the council decided was the right approach, is to allow that voice of the community to begin to have substance in how that foundation and community is actually governed. So open source foundations, as you know, are meritocratic by nature. So we want to provide a clear path for the community to earn their spots on the governance of the foundation, the community, as any good foundation does, right? If you don't, and I've seen this before, if you don't allow a true path for the community to earn their way into leadership of that community and foundation, then it's just not going to work, right?
Yeah, and I might twist the knife a little bit here and say,
first a hand grenade, now a knife. Where are we going?
Hand grenades. Hey, I'm a ex-soldier, so everything is combat related here. I think some of the sentiment sometimes is that a lot of things that happen at the council decision level are in a silo, and the community members are screaming at the top of their lungs for a certain set of features, or a certain, maybe they will write a HIP and it doesn't get the attention they think it needs to get, or maybe they don't have the skill set to write a HIP and they're like asking for somebody to help them write a HIP. There's often very passionate and very ready to move community members with a lot of energy and a lot of time. And that connective tissue doesn't necessarily exist currently between the community and the council. And I think That's part of the reason why the Foundry was built, was to kind of unify the voice of the community and create a channel to bring that to the council eventually. Originally, I was calling Brett regularly and saying, you need to hear what's going on out here. But now you're the connective tissue. But how do we bridge those two things right there? Because I think that's been a friction point. And the community's been starting to organize and do things itself, which is nice. But it sounds to me like what you're talking about is one of your requirements or mandates is to bring that community voice into the council, and vice versa, bring the council to become active in the community. Is that what I'm hearing?
Absolutely. It has to operate that way. It really does, to be successful. Yeah. And so, I'll be blunt, Ken. I wish HBAR Foundry didn't exist. I wish it was a part of the Hedera community. I understand. I really appreciate what you're doing. I understand why you're doing it, but I wish it was simply a part of the existing community.
I think all of us wish that.
Right. And we'll get there. This is going to be a transition. We're not going to do it perfectly. We're going to do it the best way we can. And just understand that is a part of the mandate. And I have certainly been communicating that we need the voice of the community as a formal part of how we move forward. And that's what we're trying to achieve. Yeah.
So how does the Foundry fit into that right now? I don't think anybody in the Foundry is opposed to merging into a Hedera sponsored structure. As a matter of fact, in the charter, we left a huge gaping hole open for a fiscal host and a legal host. Like we went from technical steering committee down, and that's it. And we left everything above it empty, because we were just like, either we're going to have to figure out how to do it ourselves over time, and that's going to take legal due diligence, or we're going to have to acquire a fiscal host, like go attach ourselves to Linux Foundation, or if Hedera builds that out. But how do you see the Foundry fitting into that strategy?
Well, so
let me rephrase that. How would you like to see the Foundry fit into your Hedera open source strategy and be?
I would like the HBAR Foundry to be and its members to be an integral part of how we move forward. What that looks like, if you become a part, or whether you stay HBAR Foundry as your own community that is integrally, I get that right, involved in the foundation. I think we need to figure that out. That's a conversation. That's a part of why we're doing things like this.
Yes.
Right.
Awesome.
So I don't have that answer. I can't make any commitments. I think it's an ongoing conversation for us to figure out. We have to take we have to take the inputs from other community members out there. Yeah. Right.
Yeah, and I think and this is something that came up recently with the Wallet Connect project and the Foundry. The Foundry was like, hey, we've got a working group for Wallet Connect. Why don't we just have all of our communication go through that, and we'll kind of bring all the wallets together and work through there. But the Wallet Connect group wanted to go do their own thing because they wanted to get it done quickly, and they didn't want to involve someone like the Foundry. And it turned out that there was actually a miscommunication where the Wallet Connect team that was actively writing the code, that were a small group of wallet developers and dApp developers that were very skilled and very focused, felt like the Foundry was saying, come join us so that we can take the credit for the work that you're doing. So they almost felt like we were trying to co-opt the press. And we're sitting there going like, oh, we don't make any money on the Foundry. We just want there to be like a town square where any project can participate. So whether it's DREC or Wallet Connect or the Guardian project, whatever projects are out there, we want those participants to feel free to, in the Foundry, create a working group or join a team. And our vision for the Foundry was really like, let's become Hedera's open source community where all of these things can happen. Because this way we get cross-pollination too. We end up having the people who are working on the Guardian project see what the Wallet Connect people are doing and adopt some stuff, or maybe make plans in the Guardian project that align with what Wallet Connect's doing. And so there's a little bit of fragmentation right now. It's kind of like everything happens in Slack, and if you're invited to the Slack channel, and if you're not, you don't know. And we really wanted the Foundry to be kind of like the way to break down those walls and at least create visibility.
Mm-hmm.
Now, there's a good argument for like, you don't want people to see how the sausage is being made initially.
Right.
And I get that. But that was kind of like the vision of the Foundry, is to kind of bring all this together. So now whether the Foundry kind of gets merged into the greater Hedera strategy, which I don't know that anybody in the Foundry would object to, that model is kind of what we're testing out and playing out right now to see how that works in the community.
Yeah, and so what the HBAR Foundry wants to do, and its members, is laudable, right? But miscommunication can happen in the most well-run foundations, right? I've seen that. We're all humans. We all miscommunicate. We all misinterpret, so on and so forth. That's not something that's going to go away. Just because we launch a perfect foundation, we're human, right? It's still going to happen. But it's ensuring that we have open ways of communicating with each other, open ways and open methods of resolving some of these issues that will inevitably arise. Right? That's what we want to. That's a part of what we want to achieve here. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, if there's a way that we can support you in your effort, that's really what we're here for. I mean, I think everybody in the Foundry, I can probably speak for most of the leadership and the regular members, but we absolutely want to work closely and support you in that effort of what you're doing. Now, we've got 3 minutes left, and I really, there's a hot topic that everybody wanted to hear about, which was you participated in it, but the Hedera's response to the RFI from the White House on to the National Cyber Director. Do you mind giving a quick summary of that in the last 3 minutes that we have here, and telling us your thoughts?
Well, my thoughts are, and obviously I received input from a number of people on that, but my thoughts are actually incorporated into the RFI, and it's an RFI, right? When prior to joining Hedera in my role with Wipro, excuse me, I was a board advisor on the OpenSSF, Open Source Software Security Foundation, right? Which is kind of the voice of open source with the U.S. federal government on some of these initiatives. And they've done a good job. What I've been really impressed about by the federal government is they're listening, and not just passively, but actively listening and reaching out to the community to get their input. So they realize that we're not going to be able to improve the security of how we develop software when that software comes from the community without engaging that community.
Right.
So one of the elements of this response that I would point out to the community that maybe I don't think I was specific about in the response was, if you have an interest in this topic, I strongly encourage you to participate. You don't even have to be a member. Participate in the OpenSSF and see what they're doing. This is the community that is pretty well organized, is well funded, and is what I really like about this is they have two important kind of streams of activities going on. One is to support the upstream community, the people that are actually writing the code, and they're trying to do this. And the federal government is participating in this process. They're trying to do this in the least invasive ways possible, because when you're the federal government, or you're even the OpenSSF, which is IBM and Google and so on, and Dell and so on, right? When you come to these developers and you say, "Hey, we're here to help," first thing is, no, you're not, right? You're here to control. And so they're both being sensitive to that issue and working with the upstream contributors. And now they're actually beginning to work with the people who consume software, which is really, really critical. Because if you don't help effect change with the developers and with the consumers,
right,
you're simply not going to improve our threat posture, our approach to building secure software. So again, you hit upon one of my high horse topics, but if this is interesting to the members here, at least lurk on some of the working groups within the OpenSSF to learn what they're doing.
Yeah, I agree 100%. And I would say everybody who's watching, keep an eye out for Hedera's open source strategies that unfolds here over the next few months and years. If you're interested in participating in the HBAR Foundry, you can go to the hbarfoundry.com. Actually, I should put a message that pops up here, hbarfoundry.com, and you can sign up as a member. We're open to everybody, whether you're a business builder or a technical builder. Andrew, thank you for taking time out of your very busy day to come chat with us. This has been very illuminating for me, and I hope that everybody else gets to see the good work that you're doing. And if there's anything we can do as a Foundry to support you, well, you're in our Zulip chat, so you feel free just to ping us directly. There we go.
All right.
Milan put that up for us. So perfect. So again, if you want to come join us, go visit us at hbarfoundry.com. Again, Andrew, thank you for your time, and have a wonderful day.
Ken, you're very welcome, and thank you for allowing me to do this. And this is the support that we need, these types of activities. So thank you.
Perfect. We're here for you. Thank you.
All right.
Cheers, everyone.
Bye-bye, everyone.